Last year, I grew 450 pounds of produce from 280 square feet of gardening space. This year, I have a goal to up that to 650 pounds of produce from the same 280 square feet gardening space. Let me show you how I plan my garden to get these yields. We will go over finding your first and last frost date, mapping out your garden so you know how much space you have to plant, figuring out what you want to plant, and how these elements come together in your garden plan. I find my first and last frost dates by going to the Old Farmer's website, clicking on gardening, then planting dates for spring and fall. Enter your city and scroll down until you see planting dates for spring. Here you'll find your last frost date. Mine is May 5th. The great thing about the Old Farmer's website is it gives you a list of crops and their suggested planting date. I find this very useful when I go to plan my seed starting. Keep scrolling until you find planting dates for fall. Here you will find your first frost date. Mine is October 10th. The Old Farmer site lets you know which crops are frost tolerant and their suggested planting date for fall as well. Okay, now that we know our first and last frost date, let's move on to mapping out our garden space. Grab your measuring tape and get into the garden and measure the width and length of all your garden beds. While you're out there, find out where north, south, east, and west are. It's important to know where south is in particular because gardens facing south get the most amount of sun in general. Take note of any trees or buildings that could be casting shadows on your garden space. Once you have all this information, it's time to begin mapping out your garden. You can use pen or paper, or they have lots of different apps for that, but I like to use Excel. I use Excel like graph paper, each little square measuring 1 square foot. I lay out my garden including measurements and cardinal directions. I also like to keep my first and last frost date there as a reference. Once you have your garden all mapped out, now it's time for the fun part. What are you going to plant? Figuring out what you want to plant for me comes down to 3 factors. What is the goal of your garden? If you're looking for enjoyment and beauty, then you might have a higher priority on planting flowers. If you're looking to save money on your grocery bill, then you'd be looking at what crops cost you the most every week and planting lots of those. If you want a variety of fresh vegetables for as long as possible during the year, then you're going to focus on becoming a master at succession planting. The second factor is what do you actually eat? Don't plant 10 kale plants if you only eat kale once in a blue moon. This year, I found out that my family only really likes to eat carrots in the fall or winter. So planting a bunch of carrots in the spring isn't the best use of my garden space. The third factor is, do you have enough growing days in your season to grow that crop? If you're in a short growing season, you might need to be picky with your variety selection to ensure that you get a harvest from that crop before the frost comes. When succession planting, you need to make sure you have enough days left in your season for that crop to reach maturity. Once you've answered all those questions and figured out what you want to plant, now it's time to plan where they will go in your garden. I like using the square foot gardening method because it gives me the most bang for my buck for the gardening space I have. I'll put a link below to a helpful guide when using the square foot gardening method. In the spring, I want to plant potatoes. I look at the reference guide and see that it's 1 potato per square foot of gardening space. I know I want to put the potatoes in my raised beds because the soil is much looser than my in-ground beds. I'll add a dot in every square foot of gardening space I want to plant potatoes. Then I'll add a label with how many I plan to plant and the crop name. Next, I want to interplant lettuce, tomatoes, and winter squash. Looking at the guide, tomatoes need 1 square foot of gardening space. I can fit 4 lettuce plants per square foot, and winter squash needs room to run. I will plant my tomatoes in an X shape with lettuces planted in between the tomato plants. I'll put a winter squash in the back. As the temperatures get warmer and the lettuce goes to seed, I will be able to pull out the lettuce plants and let the winter squash run the ground beneath the tomatoes. Following this process, I will finish planning out the spring plantings. Now that I have mapped out all the crops I can fit into the spring planting, I will look at which crops I will harvest once and be done. For example, broccoli. I harvest the main head and then I'm done because I find that I get more bang for my buck with succession planting after harvesting the main head than waiting for some side shoots. I expect to harvest my broccoli heads late June, leaving me July, August, September, and a little bit of October for some succession planting. I want more peppers and winter squash than I could fit in my spring planting plan. So I will add more sweet peppers, jalapenos, and winter squash where the broccoli was. I still have some room along the borders. I want some bok choy for ramen, some beets for roasted vegetables, and some lettuce for fall salads. So I'll add those along the border. I'll reference the fall planting dates on the old farmers' websites for the best time to plant the crops for a fall harvest. Onions will be ready to harvest late July, giving me about 2.5 months to plant a different crop. As I mentioned earlier, my family likes carrots during the fall and the winter. I will plant a quick maturing carrot immediately after I harvest the onions. As you plan your succession planting, you just keep thinking, what's in my garden now? When will I harvest it? And do I have enough growing days left to plant something else? And you just keep doing this until all your garden space is filled. Now that we know what, where, and how many of each crops we're planting, we need to plan our seed starting to have plants ready in the spring, summer, and fall. Succession planting only works if you have plants ready to go when space opens up in your garden. Subscribe and join me in the next video where I'll walk you through how I plan my seed starting.